สวัสดีค่ะ Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the APT Web Dialogue on addressing the mobile gender gap in the APAC region. My name is Gulasap Yanatip. I am the Public Relations and Project Assistant at the Asia Pacific Telecommunity or APT. I am delighted to be the MC for today's online dialogue. This APT Web Dialogue is organized by the APT in collaboration with GSMA on the occasion of the International Girls in ICT Day this year. As we know, the mobile gender gap remains a significant challenge in many low and middle income countries across the Asia Pacific region. Today, we aim to explore the latest data and insights on this issue, understand the underlying drivers, and discuss potential solutions to bridge this gap and empower more women and girls through mobile connectivity. Next, I would like to invite Mr. Masanori Kondo, the Secretary General of the Asia Pacific Telecommunity, to deliver his welcome remarks.
Okay, thank you, Kun Fong. So good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us today for this important webinar on addressing the mobile gender gap in the APAC region. As the host of this meeting, I am very excited to discuss this crucial topic with all of you. And I'd like to express our gratitude for the cooperation of GSMA, especially Ms. Claire Sibthorpe and Ms. Pippa McDougall. In today's presentation, Ms. Pippa McDougall, Senior Advocacy Manager, Connected Women from GSMA, will share the latest insights and data on mobile internet and digital financial inclusion with a particular focus on efforts to promote digital inclusion for women and the current challenges and issues related to the mobile gender gap in the APAC region. Currently, in low and middle income countries, mobile is a primary means of accessing the internet for many people. However, unfortunately, there is still a significant digital gap between women and men. To address this, we all need to collaborate, improve policies, promote education, and raise awareness across society. In today's dialogue, we will delve into the latest survey data from GSMA, focusing particularly on the APAC region. We encourage all participants to share their thoughts and questions actively, as your insights are invaluable to our discussion. Lastly, I'd like to express my sincere gratitude for your support and cooperation. I hope that the content we cover today will be beneficial to you and help us find the path forward together. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Masanori Kondo, for your remarks. Next, I would like to invite Ms. Claire Sibthorpe. Claire is a head of Digital Inclusion in the Mobile for Development, or M4D, team at GSMA. She leads the Connected Women and Connected Society programs, which are focused on accelerating digital inclusion for the underserved in low and middle income countries. Connected Women has a specific focus on accelerating digital and financial inclusion for women. Claire, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for inviting us to join you in this great session. I'd also like to thank Secretary General Mr. Masanori Kondo and the APT for your strong partnership on this topic. As you mentioned, at Connected Women, we're focused on accelerating digital and financial inclusion for women. We work with governments, operators, and other stakeholders on this issue and provide critical data like we're about to share today and insights to try and inform action. As was mentioned, mobile is the primary and it's often the only way that people in low and middle income countries access the internet. So yesterday, we launched our Mobile Gender Gap Report 2024. This is our flagship report that really features the latest data and insights on the size of the mobile gender gap and the drivers for it. And Pippa will be sharing with you a bit more in today's session. This report highlights that more women are using mobile internet than ever before, but despite this progress, there remains a significant gender gap. In fact, this year we had slightly positive news to share in that the mobile gender gap has narrowed from 19% in 2022 to 15% in 2022. This is the gender gap, mobile gender gap for low and middle income countries. And it brings us back to where we were in 2020. So some slightly positive news after 2 years where we saw stalled progress and a slowdown in women's rates of digital inclusion. But it also highlights that there's a substantial mobile internet gender gap. Specifically, women in South Asia are 31% less likely than men to use mobile internet, and 4% less likely in East Asia and the Pacific. So what does this mean? This means that women are being left behind in an increasingly connected world. And we absolutely need to address this gender gap. And doing so provides significant social and economic benefits, not just to women and their families, but societies and economies, is absolutely vital to achieving the SDGs. So while the gender gap is big, we know it can be addressed. We've seen through our Connected Women Commitment Initiative that bold commitments with clear targets and actions that really focus on the barriers that women face can make a difference. Through this initiative, mobile operators have made formal commitments with targets to accelerate digital and financial inclusion for women across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Since we launched this initiative in 2016, over 50 mobile operators have made commitments and have collectively reached over 70 million additional women with mobile internet and mobile money services. I mean, while this gender gap is driven by complex social, economic, and cultural factors that can't be addressed by one organization alone, but we can make a difference. It's unfortunately not going to close on its own, and action is needed by all stakeholders working together to better measure, understand, and address women's needs and the barriers they face. Therefore, it's critical we all working together to accelerate progress to ensure that women are not being left behind. And I would really like to thank you, APT, once again for your strong partnership. And I'll conclude my opening remarks here. Back to you, Phyllis.
Thank you, Ms. Claire Sipthorpe, for your remarks. And next, we are honored to have a speaker from GSMA who will be sharing their latest data and insights on the size and drivers of the mobile gender gap in the APAC region. This presentation will be followed by a Q&A session where you will have the opportunity to engage directly with our speaker. It is my pleasure to introduce our esteemed speaker from GSMA, Ms. Pippa McDougall. Pippa is the Senior Advocacy Manager for GSMA's Connected Women team, advocating for the digital and financial inclusion of women and girls in low and middle income countries. Prior to joining GSMA, Pippa worked as an international consultant for She Trades initiative at the International Trade Center, or ITC. Pippa, thank you for joining us today. I will now hand over the floor to Pippa for the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Kulasa, and I trust you can see my slides well. I'd also like to thank the Secretary General and, of course, APT for hosting this session and inviting the GSMA. So today, in my presentation, I'll be sharing both the size and the drivers of the mobile gender gap. I'll focus on the data specifically that we have for the APAC region. I'll speak more about what barriers women are facing when accessing and using mobile. I'll conclude by sharing some of our policy recommendations to help policymakers address the gender gap in their own countries. And then I would love to hear from you. So we'll have a short discussion at the end. And I'd love to hear from you what your government or organization is doing to address the gender digital divide in your country. So let's kick off. As some of you may be unfamiliar with the breadth of work we do at the GSMA, I'll first briefly share with you how we approach digital inclusion before I dive into the data. We place quite a strong emphasis on digital inclusion, and we have 2 programs dedicated to this, as Claire and Kulisat mentioned, our Connected Society and our Connected Women programs. And in each program, we take a 3-pillared approach to our work through insights, market engagement, and advocacy. Insights, we provide industry-leading research, case studies, and data on the mobile gender gap. Through our market engagement work, we support mobile operator partners to address both the digital divide, but also supporting them to accelerate the digital and financial inclusion for women. And then in advocacy, we engage with key stakeholders and platforms at both the global and regional level to drive increased awareness, prioritization, and most importantly, action around addressing the mobile gender gap. The data that I'll be sharing today, as Claire mentioned, can be found in our latest Mobile Gender Gap report, which was launched yesterday. And these reports findings are drawn primarily from our consumer survey, which is supplemented by other third-party data as well. Every year, the GSMA conducts a nationally representative face-to-face survey that we've conducted each year since 2017. And our most recent survey covered 12 low and middle income countries, which I'll call LMICs for short, at the end of 2023. And it has gathered critical data on the mobile gender gap. And this allows us to monitor women's access to and use of mobile over time. So last year, for the APAC region, we specifically surveyed Bangladesh, India, Indonesia, Pakistan, and we've also been able to calculate regional gender gaps for South Asia and East Asia and the Pacific with supplemented third-party data and modeling from our GSMA intelligence. So you can see on the screen the various countries we surveyed both this year and in previous years. So let's now dive into the data. I'll start with a brief overview of the state of digital inclusion across LMICs, and then I'll zoom in a moment to the APAC region. We're seeing that more women are benefiting from mobile than ever before. This is really good news. More than 65% of women now use mobile internet across LMICs. Over 80% of women now own a mobile phone. We've heard from our colleagues, mobile is the primary way people access the internet in LMICs, especially women. And just last year, mobile accounted for 84% of all broadband connections. And this is according to the ITU. We also see that women are more likely than men to access the internet exclusively on a handset. We're also seeing that access to mobile is transforming lives. We know that mobile can help empower women, making them feel more connected, more autonomous, more safe. Our data shows that the majority of female mobile internet users perceive it to have had an overall positive impact in their lives. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic really highlighted how important digital connectivity really is. However, as was mentioned, despite more people using the mobile internet than ever before, there is a significant gender gap. You can see on the slide that 66% of women now use mobile internet in LMICs. However, when you compare this with men, you see that 78% of men in LMICs use mobile internet. So this highlights that there is a substantial gender gap. And we calculate the gender gap by calculating the relative difference between these two percentages. And this describes how less likely a woman is to use mobile internet than a man. So the results of this calculation, using the figures on the slide, means that women are now 15% less likely than men to use mobile internet. And as I mentioned, we track the evolution of the mobile gender gap over time, starting in 2017. And you can see that from 2017, the gender gap in mobile internet adoption had been consistently narrowing all the way up until 2020, when it stood at 15%. And you can see that in 2020, this obviously coincides with the COVID-19 pandemic. And after years of progress, women were being disproportionately negatively impacted in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic. And then we saw the mobile internet gender gap widen slightly to 19% in 2022. But I'm pleased to report it has narrowed for the first time since 2020 and is now at 15%, meaning that across low and middle income countries, women are 15% less likely than men to use mobile internet. And this translates into 265 million fewer women than men using mobile internet. So while it has decreased, there is still a gap and targeted action is needed. And this reduction was primarily driven by South Asia, as you can see, and to a lesser extent, sub-Saharan Africa. And as you can see on this slide, the gap has remained relatively unchanged in other regions. That being said, the mobile internet gender gap varies significantly by region. There's still 785 million women across LMICs who do not use mobile internet. Almost 60% of those live in either South Asia or sub-Saharan Africa. So now looking at the regional gaps for the APAC region, in East Asia and the Pacific, the gender gap in mobile internet use is 4%. So this means that women in East Asia and the Pacific are 4% less likely than men to use mobile internet. Whereas if you compare that with South Asia, you see that the mobile internet gender gap is much wider at 31%. And this also means that in South Asia, there are still 285 million women offline in that region. So the mobile gender gap varies significantly by a region within APAC, but it also varies by country. And as you can see on this slide, you'll see the gender gap in mobile ownership on the left-hand side by country, and the mobile internet adoption, the gender gap on the right-hand side for 4 different countries in the APAC region. And you'll see that the gender gap in mobile internet adoption varies quite significantly from 8% in Indonesia to as wide as 40% in Bangladesh. Now let's zoom in even further to take one country as an example. And this is to better understand the nature and the drivers of the mobile internet gender gap. We use a simple framework called the mobile internet user journey to better understand what is preventing a woman from owning a mobile phone all the way through to using mobile internet regularly and accessing and benefiting from its full potential. So before you can use and be connected to the internet, you need to have and own a mobile phone. So we track that in our survey. And for Indonesia, we see that 88% of men own a mobile phone, but only 77% of women own a mobile phone in Indonesia. So the gender gaps start as early as mobile ownership. And it's also important to look at the type of handset people own. And we know that smartphone owners are more likely to use mobile internet than owning a basic phone. And here for Indonesia, we also see that there's a gender gap in smartphone ownership. Women in Indonesia are 11% less likely than men to own a smartphone. But now moving on to the second stage of the internet user journey, which is awareness. So once you have an internet-enabled phone, you have to be aware of the internet. And here, while awareness levels are relatively high, there also is a slight gender gap. However, even once a woman owns a phone, is aware of the internet, they don't always adopt the internet and use it. And this suggests that there's other barriers at play and preventing them from doing so. You can see on the slide that there's still a gender gap in mobile internet use, with 69% of men in Indonesia using the internet via mobile, compared to 63% of women. What's interesting here is when we move on to the fourth stage, even once men and women use mobile internet, we're seeing they're using the mobile internet differently. We look at the regularity of their use. So how often do they access the internet and for what types of purposes? And this is the diverse use cases. And even here, we see that there's gender gaps in the regularity and diversity of use in Indonesia and across many LMICs that we track. So I would like to open the floor to the audience and ask you, why do you think there's a gender gap in mobile ownership and mobile internet use in the APAC region? So if you could just take a moment to jot down a few thoughts in the chat box, and maybe to help you think, you can think about what barriers do women face in your own country to maybe owning a mobile phone. So I'll just give you 1 minute to type 1 or 2 thoughts in the chat box. I'll just wait for 1 or 2 to come in. So what kind of barriers do women face to using internet in your country, do you feel? And Kulasap, I can't see the chat box, so please let me know if any thoughts have come in. Okay, while we wait for more, I'll go on to the next slide. Our research shows that there's 5 key barriers to women's digital inclusion. The first of which is affordability. So this includes the inability to afford devices, but also it includes data plans and other service fees. There's also knowledge and digital skills is also a prominent barrier. So this includes a lack of digital skills and literacy, but also a lack of awareness and understanding of mobile internet and its benefits. Relevance is another barrier. So this includes a lack of relevant content, products, and services that meets women's capabilities and preferences. We have safety and security concerns. So this barrier includes concerns about the negative aspects and risks of mobile in the internet. So for example, it can include harassment, theft, fraud, online security. And then lastly, we have access. So this barrier includes a lack of access to networks, but also enablers. What is needed in order to access the internet? You need an internet-enabled handset. You, in many countries, need a formal identification document to get a SIM card. You need a device that is accessible and easy to use. And this can be a barrier for women in many countries. So we will have a short poll. Kulasap will put it on the screen. And the question I'd like you to respond to is, what do you think are the top barriers? So of the 5 barriers I mentioned, what do you think are the top barriers preventing women in South Asia who are already aware of mobile internet from adopting it? Is it A, affordability, B, lack of literacy and digital skills, C, safety and security concerns, D, relevance, or E, access? So I'll give you a minute to put your thoughts. So I see a few coming in. We'll wait another minute to get everyone's thoughts. Okay, I still see it sharing. So we'll share the results now. We have a slight winner of affordability at 73%. So Kulasap, are you able to share the results?
Yes, we already shared the results.
Brilliant.
Yes.
Thank you. So now let's see what the answer is. So the top barriers from our data shows the barriers preventing women in South Asia from using mobile internet are a lack of literacy and digital skills, affordability, and safety and security concerns. So with literacy and digital skills being the top barrier, followed by affordability and followed by safety and security concerns. We also know that men experience these same barriers. However, women tend to experience them more acutely, and this is due to structural inequalities, including both disparities in access to education, but also disparities in income. We know that addressing these barriers can be quite a challenge, but it presents an enormous social and economic opportunity. Last year, we did some modeling and we highlighted and found that closing the gender gap in mobile ownership and use across LMICs over an 8-year period presented a $230 billion opportunity for revenue for the mobile industry. We're also seeing there's significant benefits for governments and economies more broadly if they were to close the mobile gender gap. And we've calculated that closing the gender gap in mobile internet adoption by 2030 could provide a $700 billion revenue in terms of GDP growth for LMICs. So this has it's quite a sizable opportunity, and we know it would also contribute to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. So now that we know there is a mobile gender gap, we know the importance and the economic opportunity of addressing it. How can we go about addressing it? And here I'd like to present our framework that we developed to address the mobile gender gap. And this is a framework that the Broadband Commission Working Group on the Digital Gender Divide developed, and we have built upon, that all stakeholders and specifically policymakers can take to address the gender gap in mobile internet access to really realize this opportunity. And it identifies 4 specific action areas, which you can see on the screen. The first action area is concerned with the need for stakeholders to gain a better understanding of the relevant context. So what is the context of digital inclusion for women and girls? And this requires tracking gender disaggregated data on internet access and use. Having this data is really the first step, and it's critical for measuring the gap and also informing investments and actions to address it. The second area is integrate a gender perspective into strategies, policies, plans, and budgets. which is really about mainstreaming gender considerations and taking the gender lens when you go about implementing your projects and plans. The third action area is to address the barriers that women face to using and accessing mobile internet. For example, the affordability barrier can be addressed by policies and initiatives that lower the upfront cost of mobile handsets, particularly internet-enabled handsets. And we know that this would disproportionately benefit women. So an example of doing this for governments could be lowering mobile-specific taxes, or it could be handset financing initiatives. And then the fourth and final action area is around the need for supporting stakeholders to collaborate more effectively to address the digital gender gap. And we know that one stakeholder can't address this alone. Collaboration is really needed and can be done so by sharing good practices and lessons learned. And we have much more detailed recommendations under each of these categories in our policy report. So I've included a link to the report on this slide, and I'm aware that Kulasap and APT will be sharing this slide deck with you. So I encourage you to take a look to see what you can do specifically and concretely to address the gap. I'll also just mention quickly, within our policy report, we have examples of what other governments in the region have been doing to address the gender gap. So you can see what other countries have done to get inspired. So moving on to the next slide. Before I close, I wanted to highlight how you can collaborate with the GSMA Connected Women program to address the mobile gender gap in your country. We provide support to policymakers to address the digital divide, and we can support in a number of ways. The first of which is through our data. We have a lot of country level data, which we can share where we have it. We have regional data and expertise on the mobile gender gap, as well as other data related to digital inclusion that may be helpful for you. The second, we have policy expertise and capacity building courses, which we can deliver to policymakers. We have a whole course and workshop on bridging the mobile gender gap, which goes into a lot more detail on the recommendations and helps governments develop an action plan. The third is we can support with dialogue and provide technical assistance on policy development. We can help to facilitate industry and government workshops, as well as provide access to GSMA events. And then the fourth is on implementation. We have tools that governments can use free of charge to support. So some of the tools include our Mobile Internet Skills Training Toolkit, which we call MIST. We have a handset subsidy toolkit, and this can help governments address the affordability barrier. So I'll just provide one short example of how we supported and worked with the government of Pakistan to address the mobile gender gap there. We've spent the past year supporting the Pakistan regulator, the PTA, the Pakistan Telecommunication Authority, to develop their digital inclusion strategy. We supported by sharing our data and the barriers they face. We've also signed a letter of intent with the National Commission on the Status of Women. We're supporting them and working closely to collect gender disaggregated data to build the capacity of policymakers, improve digital skills for women. And we're also working with them to develop an awareness raising campaign to tackle social norms specifically. I'll conclude just by sharing our two reports. The Mobile Gender Gap Report, as Claire mentioned, was launched yesterday. It can be downloaded via this QR code. And I'm sharing another link to our policy report, which again has specific and concrete actions to support policymakers in addressing the various gender gaps. And I'll end my remarks here, and I would love to now hear from the audience what you think should be prioritized to address the mobile gender gap in your country, and also how your government or organization has gone about addressing the digital gender divide. Thank you for listening, and over to Kulisap to moderate.
Okay. Thank you, Pippa, for that insightful presentation. We will now move on to the Q&A session. And please click the raise hand button or submit your question through the Q&A function, because the attendee cannot send a message through the chat box. So only Q&A function. So we will address as many as possible. Okay, I see the raised hand from the attendee, Maliha Saida. Please. Okay.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. And this is Maliha Zaidi from Pakistan. I am representing my organization, Pakistan Alliance for Girls Education. We work on girls' education in Pakistan, and we are also working in collaboration with the Pakistan Telecommunication Authority to introduce some, to cover the digital gender gap in Pakistan. So my question is that basically I'm involved in designing the programs to, cover the educational loss as well as gender gap in Pakistan. So my question is, what exactly is meant by mobile gender gap? Can we cover this by introducing laptops and tablets? Because when we are talking about students, we are designing programs for education, then we look for a device that is more capable of handling the data and letting them perform more action. So do you think that it is useful for students to rely on laptops or use mobile devices only? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Claire, I'm not sure if you wanted to answer this or if you'd like me to.
Sure, I can take a stab and you can add, Pippa. Yeah, so I think, any kind of device for accessing the internet, I think is great. So I think it's useful to have laptops, computers, mobile. The reality is that most people access the internet through a mobile, which is why we look at it. One of the challenges is that we found in our research is that when people learn how to access the internet on a laptop or tablet, they often struggle to transfer those skills to a mobile. So because mobiles are different, you have apps rather than browsers, etc. So in our program, we look at really the most underserved, sort of low literacy, low income. For them, a phone is the most accessible way of accessing the internet. As I say, when they get skills on laptops, they are not necessarily able to transfer those skills to be able to apply them to mobile. But I think any kind of device that provides people with access to the internet and the skills they need to use it is an excellent initiative. I don't know if you want to add anything, Pippa.
Yeah, I'll just add one point. So we work quite closely in Pakistan, and we're seeing that social norms are playing a significant role. We're seeing family disapproval is one of the top 3 barriers. And also one of the top is a lack of literacy in digital skills. So I think any program that you're doing that seeks to improve the digital skills, be that on a laptop or a mobile, is still quite positive. Thank you. So I hope that answered your question. Maybe Kulisap, you can highlight another one from the audience.
Now I don't see any. Okay, I saw the raised hand from Miss Song Kyung Choi. Yes.
Hi everyone, I am Sun Kyung Choi from APT Secretary. Firstly, I'd like to thank you for your impressive presentation. And it was very informative to learn about the GSMA's interest and commitment to this issue. I was wondering, even within women's group, there may be differences in the digital gap based on the age or economic activity status. So I think this is crucial data when seeking appropriate solutions tailored to these differences. So does your research findings include any information related to this?
I can answer that, Pippa. So our survey, so the survey that we conduct, which forms the Mobile Gender Gap Report, is a nationally representative survey. And we can disaggregate the data by things like urban, rural, or different age groups. As you say, we are seeing differences in access by age. In the past, we've also included other factors such as persons with disabilities and looked at how it plays out for women with disabilities and the different barriers they face. So yes, to answer your question, in our survey, we at a high level, we can disaggregate against certain factors. It depends on the factor and whether the sample size becomes big enough or whether we've asked the question, but certain factors for definitely, and we're happy to share more. But I'm also completely agreeing with you that women are absolutely not a homogeneous group, and it's critical to have data looking at these different segments. Because the digital inclusion and the barriers they face do differ.
Okay, I saw one more raised hand from Mr. Don Ho Kim. Please. Mr. Kim, please.
Thank you for good information. Good afternoon, everyone. It is hard to imagine a mobile gender gap in South Korea, my home country, where men and women are equal in all aspects. While it's surprising that such mobile gender gaps exist in many countries, I believe this is not merely an issue of mobile technology, but rather influenced by the broader cultural context of each country, including the conditions for women's social participation and their social status. Therefore, addressing the mobile gender gap requires more than just piecemeal ICT policies. It demands comprehensive solutions that tackle the underlying issues of gender discrimination. However, considering the mobile gender gap specifically still holds its own significance. In this regard, affordability has been identified as a major cause in the presentation. What are some exemplary policy examples that have been effective in addressing this issue?
Thank you for your question. Maybe I can take this one. So I'll answer your question in two parts. So first, just want to clarify that our data specifically looks at low and middle income countries. South Korea being a higher income country, we wouldn't have data for. So I would hazard a guess that there's a very little to no mobile internet gender gap in South Korea, as you mentioned. The second part is, I agree with what you said. We do need a holistic approach to address the barriers. And again, a wide range of stakeholders are needed with targeted action. Now, to get to your point on affordability, what can policymakers do specifically? One of the biggest things they can do is enact policies that help to lower the upfront cost of a handset. We know that women tend to be more price sensitive, so any policies that can support their ability to afford a phone would be helpful. So for example, some governments currently tax or treat handsets or smartphones as a luxury good, and that increases the cost of a smartphone. Where countries have removed that tax and have lowered the cost of a smartphone or a mobile phone, we see that more women are able to afford it, and it drives uptake and adoption of mobile ownership. So that's one example. Another example is we've seen some governments put forth handset subsidy initiatives. So they subsidize the cost of a handset to make it more affordable for certain groups, including marginalized women or people from rural areas or a specific region. So there's different policies that governments can adopt to help the affordability barrier. And just to flag again, very granular and specific recommendations can be found in our policy report. So I encourage you to take a look at that, and the link will be shared in this presentation. Thank you. Back to you, Kulisap.
Thank you, Pippa. Yeah, I think we can take one more question from the audience, and I think it will be the last question. Does GSMA have any project in Nepal with government or INGO or NGO to increase the mobile gender gap? Or is there anywhere INGO can put the proposal? Yeah, that's the question.
That's a very good question. So to my knowledge, at least on my Connected Women program, we don't currently work in Nepal. However, maybe Claire can add to that answer.
Yeah. There's so the other program that we're delivering is something called Women in the Digital Economy Fund, and that there are opportunities to submit proposals. I'll put it in the link in my response, but it's ydef.global, and where there are rounds for opening for support. And obviously, if for Connected Women, we provide lots of data and insights and support and guidance. And from you're welcome to reach out to us, and we're happy to support you. But if you're looking for funding, then it's the YDEF Global.
Thank you, Claire. And now I think that one is the last question. So thank you, Pippa and Claire, for your comprehensive answers and for sharing your expertise with us today. I hope our audience found this session as informative and engaging as I did. Before we conclude, we would like to hear the feedback of this session from all of you. So we request you to complete the survey shared by email previously, and your feedback will help us to improve the future events to be more beneficial to you. Now, I would like to extend our gratitude to GSMA for their valuable contribution to this dialogue, and to all of our participants for your active engagement and insightful questions. This dialogue has provided us with important insight into the mobile gender gap, and it highlighted the steps we need to take to promote the digital inclusion and gender equality in this ICT sector. Thank you once again for joining us today. Let us continue to work together to empower women and girls across the Asia-Pacific region. This concludes our APT Web Dialogue on addressing the mobile gender gap in the APAC region. Have a wonderful day, and we look forward to seeing you at our future events. Thank you and goodbye.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Korea. Thank you, Pipa.
Bye bye.